a scar, a painful past, and a world that only saw imperfections. But what if the strength to heal lies in being truly seen? Meet Lena, a woman whose bravery was hidden behind her scars until one man, Julian, showed her that beauty isn't about being perfect. Through ridicule and silence, will Lena find the courage to embrace herself? This powerful journey of self-acceptance and love will make you question everything about what it means to be whole. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next chapter of Lena's story. Lena Rivers walked through the bustling diner, the sharp clatter of dishes and the sizzle of bacon filling the air like the soundtrack of a world she no longer felt a part of. Each step she took was methodical, practiced, and yet there was always a part of her that wished she could just disappear into the background, unnoticed. The customers were rarely kind. She had learned long ago to hide her vulnerability behind a mask of polite smiles and swift service. As she tied her apron, she could feel the weight of their eyes even before they looked at her. She moved behind the counter with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. Her hands moved deftly, balancing plates of eggs and hash browns with the grace of a dancer. She did it all without thinking, keeping her focus on the orders, keeping her head down, letting the noise of the diner swallow her up. But it didn't swallow the whispers. She knew they were there. A pale scar traced from her temple to just above her cheekbone, a mark that had been etched into her skin 12 years ago when she had saved her younger brother from a burning car. She hadn't cared about the scar then. She had only cared about getting Ben out. But now, every time she looked in the mirror, it was the first thing she saw. It didn't matter that it was a symbol of bravery to her. To the world, it was a blemish, a flaw. As Lena passed booth 3, a group of young professionals, impeccably dressed and already half a mimosa deep into their Friday brunch, burst into laughter. Their laughter had a sharp edge to it, one that cut through the air like a knife. As she approached their table, one of the men leaned over to his friend and muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Well, that's one way to kill your appetite." His friend snorted, clearly amused, and followed up, "What happened? Did she fall face first into a blender?" The sound of their laughter filled the room, and Lena's heart dropped into her stomach. It was a moment she had faced too many times before, but this time it felt different. The weight of their words pressed down on her chest, threatening to break her calm exterior. She said nothing. She couldn't. There was nothing she could say to make them understand. Instead, she set the plates down gently in front of them, her hands steady despite the heat rising in her chest. But then, one of them added, "You think a place with decent omelets could spring for staff that didn't double as Halloween extras?" Their laughter spilled over, reckless and cruel, and Lena kept her gaze fixed on the table, refusing to let them see the impact of their words. But she could feel the sting of every eye in the diner on her, flickering between her and the group of men. Lena paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts, her anger burning but contained. She didn't flinch. She didn't break. She turned slowly, locking eyes with the man who had spoken. Her voice was even when she asked, "Is there anything else you need, sir?" He blinked, surprised by her calmness. For a moment, he seemed taken aback, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, maybe a little makeup," he said with a smirk. "Or a curtain." She didn't break. She didn't react. Instead, she nodded once and turned away, walking back to the counter, her chest tight with the fury she refused to let escape. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move on, focusing on the task at hand, the endless orders, the demands of the customers. But as she worked, she felt something inside her shift, something unfamiliar, a recognition that for the first time, she hadn't hidden. She hadn't cowered. And then there was Julian. Across the room, sitting in a quiet corner booth, a man had been watching the entire exchange. He hadn't turned away in discomfort, as so many had. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze following her as she returned to the counter, unfazed, as if nothing had happened. Julian was dressed neatly in a dark blazer, his shirt open at the collar, his leather-bound notebook resting beside his half-finished coffee. Unlike the others, he didn't shrink away. He saw her. And in that moment, when their eyes met, Lena didn't feel the weight of the scar on her face. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel ugly. Later, when the group of men finally left with a careless tip and louder laughter, Julian motioned for the check. Lena walked over, her heart still heavy, but steadied by the presence of this man who had quietly observed the entire scene. As she handed him the check, he looked up at her and said, "No, thank you, for handling that with more grace than they deserved." His words landed in her chest like a soft echo, and she felt something in her crack open, just a little. "It's strange," he added quietly, "how some people think they're seeing a flaw when really they're just too small to understand the shape of strength." Lena blinked, stunned by the depth of his words. She didn't know how to respond at first. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not without pity, but with admiration. She simply nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips, and then, for the first time, felt like she was truly seen. The days that followed the encounter with Julian were a blur for Lena. She had spent so many years keeping her head down, trying to be invisible, that the idea of someone, especially someone like Julian, seeing her so clearly felt like a jolt to her very core. She kept telling herself that it was nothing, that he was just another guy who had witnessed her handling the rude customers with composure. But there was something in his eyes, something different from the pity or discomfort she was used to. It was admiration, quiet and unspoken, yet it rang through her like the sound of a bell. Lena didn't see him for a few days after that. The diner was busy with the usual morning rush, the never-ending cycle of orders and plates, but her mind kept drifting back to his words. Some people think they're seeing a flaw, when really they're just too small to understand the shape of strength. She couldn't stop hearing them, couldn't stop wondering if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she had convinced herself she was all these years. But the thought felt strange, like a foreign language she had only just started to understand. Then, 3 days later, when the breakfast rush had quieted down and the soft murmur of local radio played in the background, Lena saw him again. Julian was sitting in his usual booth by the window, the same quiet corner where the light fell just right, casting shadows across the table, making it feel like his own little world. There was something in the way he sat, so relaxed, his posture open, yet somehow thoughtful, like he wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere, not in a rush to move on to the next thing. It was a stark contrast to the hurried, bustling world around them. Lena tried to shake off the flutter of nerves in her chest as she walked over to him, the scent of fresh coffee and eggs following her steps. She stood for a moment, taking in the sight of him, the way his eyes lifted when he saw her, the faint smile that tugged at his lips. He wasn't just waiting for his food, he was waiting for her too. He made her feel like she was the only person in the room, and she didn't know how to handle that. She had been seen so many times in her life, but always for the wrong reasons. Her scar, her past, her pain, those were the things people saw, not her. "You again?" she asked, trying to keep the tone casual, masking the warmth that spread through her chest. She wasn't sure if she wanted to ask him to leave, or if she wanted him to stay. But he had already made up his mind. "I figured it was safe," Julian replied, his voice light, almost teasing. "I don't see any blender jokes flying around today." Lena snorted, a reluctant smile breaking through. "We save those for Saturdays," she said with a hint of sarcasm, but there was a warmth in her voice now, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Julian smiled back. "Good to know." He ordered his usual, black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just a simple request that made Lena feel, for some reason, seen in a way that no one else had ever made her feel. She raised an eyebrow as she set the order down in front of him, taking in his relaxed demeanor, the way his eyes lingered on the pie like it was a precious memory. It made her pause, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was how people saw things when they didn't feel the need to hide parts of themselves. "My mother used to make pie like this," Julian said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper as he looked down at the plate. His eyes softened, and for a moment, Lena could see something vulnerable there, something human. Not perfect, a little messy, the kind of crust that never quite held its shape, but always tasted like safety. Lena's breath caught in her throat, and she felt an odd flutter in her chest. She didn't know why, but his words settled into her, like a memory she had forgotten, It was strange. She felt like she was seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. His vulnerability, his strength, everything that made him real. It was as if she had always been looking through a window, but now the glass had been wiped away, and she could see clearly for the first time. "I baked that one," she said, before she could stop herself. Julian looked up, his gaze steady. "That explains everything," he said with a smile, and Lena felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she was merely surviving. She wasn't the girl with the scar, the girl with the tragic past. She was just Lena. And Julian was the first person who hadn't seen her for what she had been through, but for who she was right in this moment. And then, as if something had shifted in the air between them, something they had both been holding back, Julian's voice dropped lower, more serious. "You know," he began, looking at her with a level of honesty that made her heart skip a beat, "you're stronger than most people I know." The words settled over her like a soft, warm blanket. For the first time, she didn't feel the sting of the scar. She didn't feel the weight of the past. All she felt was the strange, unfamiliar sense of being truly seen. The days after Lena's brief interaction with Julian passed in a blur, her mind often wandering back to the words he had said, to the quiet way he had seen her without pity, but with genuine admiration. His words replayed in her mind like a melody, gentle yet powerful. For a moment, she had allowed herself to feel something different, something she hadn't felt in years: hope. But that fragile hope began to crumble under the weight of the world around her. The gossip that had spread like wildfire about her and Julian, the cruel comments from strangers, all of it came rushing back, suffocating her. It wasn't just the cruel jokes at the diner that had pierced her so deeply. It was the betrayal of her own image in the public eye. The headline, the pictures, the online comments, they stripped her of her dignity and reduced her to a side note in someone else's story. A scarred waitress to be mocked, ridiculed, and pitied. Her scar had become her identity in the eyes of the world. No longer was she the brave sister who saved her brother from a burning car. Now she was just the girl with the scar, forever defined by it. The weight of it was unbearable, and it made her want to hide, to vanish. She had avoided answering Julian's messages, too afraid of facing him, too afraid of what the world had made her feel. But as the days passed, her silence grew louder, deafening. She couldn't escape it. Her thoughts were always circling back to him, to the way he had seen her, to the way he had stood there, not looking away, not pitying her, but respecting her. She had never known how to accept that kind of attention, that kind of validation. One rainy afternoon, when the city felt quieter, almost softer under the weight of the storm, Lena walked out of the diner. Her shift had ended early, the hum of the espresso machine and the chatter of the customers still echoing in her ears. She hadn't planned on leaving, but it felt like the right thing to do. The oppressive weight of the gossip, the comments, it was too much. The world felt too loud, too judgmental. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the rain came down harder, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself, the water seeping into her shoes. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she needed to be away from the diner, away from everything that reminded her of what she had become in the eyes of others. It was then that she saw him. Julian stood by the corner, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, his eyes scanning the street, as if waiting for something, or someone. The moment their gazes met, a wave of something unspoken passed between them. A connection that hadn't been broken, even through the silence. Lena's heart skipped a beat, but she hesitated. She wasn't ready to face him, not yet. She was still too raw, too exposed, but Julian didn't seem to notice her hesitation. He took a step forward, his expression softening as he saw her. "Lena," he said, his voice low, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. "Can we talk?" She didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much she resented the world for making her feel so small, so unseen, for reducing her to just her scar. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded and stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked together to a nearby bench, the rain dripping from the trees above them, a soft mist in the air. It was oddly peaceful, despite the storm. The sound of the rain became a soft background to their silence, as if the world had momentarily paused to give them space. I know you're angry, Julian began, his voice steady, his gaze focused on her. But you're not alone in this. I know the world sees you through that scar, but I see you for who you are. Not a scarred waitress, just you, Lena. Lena turned her face away, the floodgates threatening to open. She had spent so many years hiding from this very moment. The moment where she would have to face herself, face the truth that no matter how much she tried to hide, her scar was a part of her. It wasn't something to be ashamed of. But the weight of the world's judgment had made her believe otherwise. I never asked for this, she whispered, her voice cracking. I never asked for people to look at me like this. I know, Julian said softly. But I also know that you've carried this for so long, and it's not your burden to bear alone anymore. You don't have to hide anymore. Not from me, not from the world, and definitely not from yourself. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't try to hide them. She let them fall freely, the weight of everything she had been holding on to for so long coming crashing down. Julian's presence beside her was a steady anchor, grounding her in a way she had never felt before. You don't have to carry the world's opinion on your shoulders, Julian continued, his voice gentle but firm. You're more than what they say you are. You're more than your scar. You're Lena, and that's enough. For the first time, Lena believed him. She believed that she could be enough. Maybe it wasn't about hiding her scar. Maybe it was about accepting it, about seeing it as part of her story, not something to be ashamed of. And as Julian reached out to her, his hand gentle on her shoulder, Lena realized that the world didn't define her. She did. It was time to stop hiding. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living. The days that followed Lena's brief moment of emotional release were quiet, but the storm that had passed through her heart had not completely settled. She went back to the diner, putting on her apron as though nothing had changed, resuming her place behind the counter. But everything felt different now. Her once impenetrable facade had cracked, and she couldn't simply pretend that nothing had shifted. The world outside still saw her as the girl with the scar. But inside, a small, fragile part of her was starting to awaken, to believe that maybe she wasn't just a collection of flaws, but a whole person with strength, beauty, and a story that was uniquely hers. Despite her newfound clarity, the whispers and stares hadn't disappeared. People still came in with their quiet judgments, their sideways glances. Yet as Lena moved through the motions of her daily routine, a soft resolve started to grow within her. She no longer felt the need to shrink away from her scar, from the past, from the hurt. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like everything would crumble under the weight of judgment. But there was something about the way Julian had looked at her, with nothing but quiet respect, that gave her the strength to stand tall. One morning, as she wiped down the counter, her eyes caught sight of him again. Julian had come back to his usual booth, the same quiet corner by the window, the same thoughtful expression on his face. The way he sat there, looking out at the city with an air of patience and contemplation, made him seem almost like a permanent fixture in the fabric of her life. It was strange how someone could become so integral to your world without you even realizing it. She approached him with the usual hesitancy, unsure of how to interact with him now that everything had changed. But when he looked up at her, there was no judgment in his gaze, no awkwardness, just a calm, steady presence that seemed to make everything feel a little more manageable. "Morning," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Same as usual?" Julian smiled, a familiar softness in his eyes. "Same as usual," he replied, though this time there was something more in his voice, an undercurrent of understanding, as if they were speaking without needing words. Lena set his order in front of him, black coffee and a slice of apple pie. The pie, he had once explained, reminded him of his mother, of a time when life felt simpler, warmer. It was the kind of thing that people shared without thinking, a slice of comfort in a world that was often far too harsh. They didn't speak much that morning. There were moments when words seemed unnecessary, when the quiet between them felt more intimate than any conversation could be. But Lena couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind, that the quiet wasn't just a refuge. It was also the calm before another storm. She couldn't help but wonder if she was fooling herself. If Julian, for all his kindness, would eventually grow tired of her scars, of her history. It wasn't until the end of his visit, as he stood to leave, that he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. It was simple, plain, no return address, just his name written carefully on the front. "For you," he said, his voice soft, almost as if the gesture was too vulnerable for words. Lena stared at the envelope for a moment before reaching for it, her heart beating faster than usual. She didn't know why, but she could sense that whatever was inside, it was important. The gesture itself, giving her something, anything, felt like an unspoken promise. Something more than just a random act of kindness, something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, as she accepted it. Julian nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the envelope and her racing thoughts. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She could feel the anticipation building within her, wondering what could possibly be inside. When she opened it, there was a small, folded piece of paper inside. She carefully unfolded it, reading the words written in neat handwriting. "I see you, not just the scar, but the person you are. And that person is worth knowing." For a moment, Lena's breath caught in her throat. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. It wasn't just a compliment or a gesture. It was a recognition that she wasn't just the sum of her past or the label the world had put on her. She was Lena, and she was more than enough. Tears stung the corners of her eyes as she folded the paper back up and pressed it to her chest. The world had never made space for her to be seen this way, without pity, without judgment, but Julian had. He had seen her as a whole person, not defined by what had happened to her, but by who she was and who she had become. In that moment, Lena made a decision. She would stop hiding. She would stop seeing herself through the eyes of others. Maybe it was time to stop pretending that her scar was something to be ashamed of. Maybe it was time to accept it, because it wasn't a mark of weakness. It was a testament to her strength, her survival, her resilience. And as she stood there, in the quiet of the diner, Lena finally let herself believe that she was worthy of all the good things that might come her way, scars and all. Lena hadn't expected to see him again. Not like this. Her decision to leave the diner, to step away from the world she had been inhabiting for so long, felt like a necessary escape from everything that had been suffocating her. The flood of online comments, the whispers, the pitying looks, it had all become too much. But as she walked through the streets of Brooklyn, the rain falling softly around her, she realized that she wasn't just running from the outside world. She was running from herself, from the truth that she had hidden for years, her scar, her past, and the things she was too afraid to face. The rain grew heavier as she walked, the streets slick with water, puddles forming in the cracks of the sidewalk. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, as if that would shield her from everything. But it wasn't the rain she was trying to shield herself from. It was the weight of her own story, the parts of herself she had tried to bury. She didn't want to face it. She didn't want to admit that, even now, after everything, she still cared what people thought. And then, just as she was about to turn down a side street, she saw him. Julian was standing at the corner, his back to her, his coat collar turned up against the rain. His presence seemed to draw the energy around him into a calm stillness, like the moment before the storm breaks. Lena hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. She had spent so much time avoiding this moment, avoiding him. But here he was, standing like he had been waiting for her, as though he knew she would come. She didn't know what to do. She could turn around, pretend she hadn't seen him, and keep walking. Or she could stop, face him, and confront everything that had been holding her back. The uncertainty, the fear, the doubt, it was all swirling inside her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But in that instant, when Julian turned and their eyes met, something shifted. Lena felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble, just a little. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years running from the truth of who she was. But in his gaze there was no judgment, no expectation, just understanding. It was like the world had finally slowed down, and for the first time she felt truly seen. "Hey," Julian said, his voice soft but steady. I've been looking for you." Lena stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She was afraid to let him in, afraid of what might happen if she did. But there was something in the way he was looking at her, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going to turn away. Not like the others. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. "I know," Julian replied, his tone gentle, understanding. "But I couldn't just let you disappear, not like this." Lena felt a sharp ache in her chest, the kind that comes with a deep, unspoken truth. She had tried so hard to hide, to vanish, but here he was, a quiet, steadfast presence in the chaos of her life. And for the first time, she wasn't running away. She was standing still, facing him, letting herself feel the weight of everything she had been trying to outrun. "I don't know if I can do this," Lena confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can keep going, not with everything they've said. The comments, the looks, it's too much." Julian reached out, his hand warm and steady as he placed it gently on her arm. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "You've been carrying this for so long, but you don't have to carry it by yourself anymore." Lena looked at him, her breath hitching in her throat. The weight of his words sank into her heart, and for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. Maybe it was okay to not have all the answers, to not have everything figured out. Maybe it was okay to let someone in. "I don't know if I can stop hiding," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice raw, unguarded. "You don't have to stop hiding all at once," Julian replied, his voice warm and understanding. "Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to do everything at once. You just have to start." The rain had started to slow, and for the first time in days, Lena didn't feel like she was drowning. She didn't know what the future held, or how things would change, but for the first time, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something new. Something real. And as Julian smiled at her, his hand still gently resting on her arm, Lena realized that maybe it wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about hiding the parts of herself she didn't want others to see. It was about being seen, scars and all, and accepting that she was worthy of love, worthy of kindness, just as she was. Maybe this was where she began. This story teaches us that true beauty and strength aren't found in perfection or in hiding our flaws. Lena's journey reminds us that our scars, whether physical or emotional, are not marks of weakness, but of survival, resilience, and growth. The world often tries to define us by our past, by what is visible on the outside, but it's the internal strength that truly shapes who we are. The kindness and understanding shown by Julian helped Lena see herself differently, not as someone defined by a scar, but as a whole person worthy of love and acceptance. In life, we are often our own harshest critics, believing that our imperfections make us unworthy. But the story shows us that when we allow others to see us, truly see us, scars and all, we open ourselves to healing, growth, and the possibility of unconditional love. Sometimes all it takes is someone else believing in us for us to begin to believe in ourselves. So what can we take away from this story? The lesson is clear. Embrace who you are, flaws and all. Your story is uniquely yours, and it is worth sharing with the world. Don't let the judgment of others define you. Instead, define yourself by the strength and grace you carry within. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for being here with us. We'll see you in the next one.